Hey everybody, this is Ted Forbes and welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. And today we're going to continue on in our creative process bit on this project that I'm working on. And we started this last week when I was doing some initial concepting. And I kind of have a working title for this today. And so what the actual idea is that I'm doing a set of prints and they're portraits of people who live in the building where my studio is. My studio is doing a 100-year anniversary party and we're doing an art exhibition as part of that. And I've been invited to participate. I thought this would be a great little project to loop you guys in on and show you kind of what goes on with the creative process from the entire beginning to the end. And last week we looked at some of the inspiration that I'm looking to and some of the ideas that I have and kind of some of the reference material I'm looking forward to on that. And the whole idea is that the building is turning 100. The residents have been here. I mean, I've been in this building for a good 10 years. And so, you know, we're a large chunk of that, but we're not the whole 100. So what I want to do is I want to introduce a little bit of a layer of abstraction into the portraits. And so I think what I'm going to do with this is I want to play with focus and I want to do that via depth of field. I want to use a blurred nature as the point of abstraction. And the reason I've chosen to go that route is because with depth of field, you know, you have such a small, or when you break it down to something that's really wide in aperture, you have a very small depth of field. So you can retain elements that are not as abstract within that. So I know this may sound kind of weird and hopefully it'll unfold as a little more as we get into it. And last week we looked at some images that talk about some of the inspiration that I've drawn from the project, people like Gerhard Richter that I've kind of been looking to for that source of inspiration. And so that's what I want to continue with today. Now, I've decided that what I want to do with this is if you're really looking for some intense depth of field, I'm going to shoot film for this because I want to do my prints that way. I'm going to do medium format. So I've decided on those two things. And then I thought, well, you know, one thing that really helps if you really want a narrow depth of field is to shoot with longer focal length lenses. And so if you use something like a telephoto or something like that, you know, f4 is a lot more thin with that focal length than it is on something that's wider. So that's one thing I wanted to look into. And my immediate reaction is that, you know, I've got a Hasselblad, but I only have an 80mm lens, which is kind of the standard focal length. Well, I decided that for this project, I don't, since there's really no client and there's no money that's coming into this, I don't want to spend money. I want to use things I've got. And I think that's a really important lesson even for the show, is that it's really not about the equipment. It's really easy to start thinking, oh, well, hey, I need another lens for my Hasselblad and I need to order it and I need to get, and then you realize that, you know, with older lenses and stuff that I probably would be getting into, you're going to be dealing with, you know, focal distance and how close you can actually focus on something. So anyway, what I decided to do is I'm going to go with my Pentacon system on this. We talked about the Pentacon 6 a while back, and I'm going to go ahead and that's the camera that I'm going to use to do this project. And so what I'm going to do is I want to take you over and I want to show you what I'm working on with the camera that's actually going to make this work. And these are things that I've already had. I have an 180mm lens. The focal distance on that is pretty long, so it's really hard to get good portrait close-up shots sometimes. Plus I want a really narrow depth of field, so I'm going to use some extension tubes. So I think it's probably easier to explain this to you rather than to just sit here and describe it. So let's go over and let's have a look at the Pentacon 6. This is the Pentacon 6 that I'm going to be using on this project, and I covered this camera a few months ago and we did an episode on the Pentacon 6, and one of the things that's really cool about this is, you know, for getting into a medium format system type deal, in other words, you want to own more than one lens, you want to get some attachments and stuff for doing macro and stuff, I still think that the Pentacon 6 is a wonderful choice in that regard because, you know, you can get them relatively inexpensively, and, you know, I just think that it's a wonderful camera, and even if something goes wrong or breaks or needs to be fixed, you're still not out of a whole lot of money. Whereas if you get into something like a Hasselblad system, I mean, sure, they're great also, but you know, as soon as you start buying a lot of lenses and a lot of attachments, that's where it's going to start to add up, even though you can probably find an 80mm lens in a body at a reasonable price. But anyway, this is not really about that today. What I want to talk about is the Pentacon 6 and the application that we're using this on. You can see that this has a mammoth size lens on it. This is a 180mm lens, and so this is kind of considered the telephoto length. I think there were some that were actually, I know there were some that were longer. You know, this is probably a little long for the portrait range. You probably want for a medium format camera, I don't know, it depends on your application, but 120, 135 if you can find it. And this is the closest that I have because it's the lens that I own, or it's one of the lenses that I own for this camera. Now, one of the problems that I have with this lens is that it's a wonderful lens. This is a Zeiss sonar design, and there's nothing wrong with it. f2.8 is the widest aperture, which is very wide for a lens of this vintage and this focal length. Sometimes about 4 is the best you're going to do, so you lose a stop there. But anyway, one of the things I really like about this is that the optics, I mean, these are designs by Zeiss that haven't really changed in a number of years. They're largely still used in Zeiss designs now. Now, lens coatings and things like that have improved slightly, but again, for the money, if you're shooting medium format, particularly black black and white like I'm doing on this is a really smart way to go and a good setup. Now, one of the disadvantages to this lens of this era and this vintage is that the close minimum focus distance is pretty far out. And I don't remember what it is exactly. It should say on the lens, and this is in meters and feet. So the closest I can go is 5.5 feet or 1.7 meters. So it's a ways out. So if you want to do macro on this lens, you have a couple options. You can use a bellows rig, and there is a bellows rig that exists for the Pentacon 6. I've got one. However, it does not fit this lens. This lens is just too big to get on there. And actually, a slightly easier way to go about this is to use these extension tubes that they actually made for the Pentacon 6. Now, these came in several models. There's what they call a manual tube. This is the automatic version, and I'll show you why in a second. And this is actually 4 of them stacked together, but they came earlier on in this metallic finish. They are black on the inside, as you can see. So that's matted, so you're not going to get reflection or glare. Later on, the whole thing was black, the later models of these. And there's 4 tubes in here, and basically they come in, I believe it's 15. This is the odd one, it's like 20.5, and then 30 millimeter tube here, and then a 60 millimeter tube, and that's just the length of the tube. And so depending on how close you want to readjust that focus, there's no glass in here, it's just a tube, and literally you're going to put this between the camera and the lens, and this is going to it's like moving a magnifying glass in and out as far as the focal plane goes. What you're going to do is you're end up changing the projection, thus changing the minimum focal distance, and you're in macro mode depending on how far you want to go with this. If you just need a little bit of a jump, sometimes that 15 millimeters is all you need to get going. If you need a lot of jump, then the 60 is probably more what you're going to need. Just depends on what you're doing, how big you want to enlarge, and what your application is. So the other thing you need to know about these that's kind of funky, before I move on, these are what's called the automatic, and you can kind of see this little pin sticking out the bottom there. And basically what that does is it's an aperture release pin. And so the automatic version of this basically meant that you have full aperture preview while you're framing up and while you're, focusing. And then when it actually takes the exposure, the pin drops out and the aperture closes before the shot's taken, and that's the automatic nature. The non-auto version of this, I think it's pretty much what you see is what you get metering, so you're gonna have to stop down. So sometimes it's hard to focus when it gets really dim at smaller apertures. All that to say, the other thing you need to know about these extension tubes is depending on what lens you've got, well, all lenses have this, but there is an exposure compensation factor that occurs. And basically all this means is, let me show you here. If I take this lens, and I'm going to basically put this between the lens and the body. If I take this extension tube, I meant to say, sorry. So we'll go ahead and open that up. And so really it's as easy as lining up the pin for the mount. We'll put that on, you lock the collar, and then we'll go ahead and put the lens on the front. And you can see the lens physically is moved away from the camera body for doing macro lenses. So what this does is it changes, the focal distance, changes a lot of things in the lens. So I'm able to get really close focus on stuff now. It does take away the infinite focus, but the idea is to shoot macro or something before you. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get one thing in focus, and then what I want to do is create abstraction through that depth of field or through the blur, or I can't stand the word bokeh, but or if you want to call it that. So what you can see here is that we have, and this is the important part, is we have moved the lens away from the body. Now, the trouble with that is that you have light intensity that falls off when you move it away. And this same effect occurs if you have a large format rail camera and you move the lens out past the focal length. That's what happens, is you end up having, it does change your focus, and I can get the effect that I want. It's going to increase the depth of field slightly. You're going to really start blurring out the background depending on how long attachment you've got. And then the most important thing that you need to consider is the exposure changes, because you have light fall off. And it's fairly obvious, if you take the lens and move it away from the camera, the light starts moving away as well. And it's just a effect of the magnification that happens on these lenses and these cameras. And so you do need to understand how to compensate the exposure for that. And that compensation is not, there's some formulas that we're going to look at in a second. I'll show you how you can calculate that, but it's different depending on what focal length lens you're using. For instance, if I'm using an 80 millimeter lens with the same tube, the light fall off is calculated differently, or that exposure compensation. So what you're going to have to do essentially is I'm going to show you a formula you can use to get at this, and then what it means is you're going to need more light onto the film, which means, okay, so if you use a handheld meter, and let's say the meter that I take has me at f8, and I have a 60 millimeter tube on here, I'm going to have to readjust that, and usually it opens up depending on the focal length of the lens. We'll look in a second and see what it is, but it's usually going to be at least a third of a stop, and it can be, depending on your focal length, it can be up to 2 stops. So, or sometimes even higher. So we'll look at magnification factor in a second. We move over to the computer to look at the test images that I'm doing on this. So that's one thing to bear in mind while you're doing this. Now, If you were using a modern digital camera or even a 35 millimeter SLR, anything that has through the lens metering. So in other words, you don't have to use an external light meter. The light meter is inside the camera. This camera does not have one. It is going to be metering from through the lens, and so you don't need to make any adjustments. It will automatically just see the light as fall off, and it'll take it accordingly. So if you ever use an extension tube with a digital camera, for instance, I mean, there's so many macro lenses right now, you really don't need to. Even with 35 millimeter cameras that were built big in the 70s and 80s, you really didn't need to at that point either. But anyway, my point is you don't have to do any adjustments. The meter, because it's through the lens, is going to already notice the fall off, and it's going to give you the correct metering, so nothing needed. So this method of what I'm talking about with exposure compensation is really when you're manually metering the scene with an external light meter. So let's go over to the computer. I want to look at the test shots, and I also want to give you a formula for calculating what that exposure difference is. So before we get into the text images, I want to talk about exposure compensation when you're dealing with moving the lens. And this applies to, in our case here, where we're using a camera with extension collars or extension tubes. And, you know, basically you're moving the lens away from the body of the camera, and it does have light fall off. And we're going to see how this works. This also applies to large format. If you're using a large format camera, using a rail, and you're doing macro photography by extending that front extension out, you know, you're going to have the same light fall off. And there's a mathematical way of calculating this, and I'm going to try to make this as exciting as I can. We're getting into some boring math here, but I will put these links in the show notes here. And so, you know, if you want to see them, you can go to theartofphotography.tv, go to the show, and I'll link them all up there. But basically, I found this on hasselbladhistorical.eu, which is a lot of historical Hasselblad information, but they do have the mathematical calculations for doing this. And there's a lot of formulas in here, and it talks about focusing mount, internal focusing, etc. Illumination equals energy divided by distance square, etc. And so what we get in here for the formulas, you have to calculate magnification, which is the extension divided by the focal length of the lens. Once you have that number for magnification, then it's really easy to figure out what your aperture and shutter speed changes need to be. Now remember, I mentioned this earlier because you know, if you were using through the lens metering, in other words, you're using your camera's meter, it is built in, and it is pulling that light exposure through the lens, you don't have to worry about any of this. It's going to figure out the compensation. This is if you're using a manual camera and you're using an external light meter, or you're using a large format camera or something like that. This is what you need to know. And I think it would probably be worth doing this in a separate video as well one day. But anyway, I'm going to show it to you right here. This is a lot of stuff. I have this link in here, and it's real boring and it's real confusing. I came up with a slightly more interesting way of presenting this, and we'll share this link as well. I put a Google Doc, and I will be more than happy to share this with you guys. And so I just basically built a spreadsheet in here. And so, you know, each one of these lines more or less is the same thing. And I'll show you how to do this. What you want to do is under the extension column and focal length column, you want to basically list the millimeter. This is in millimeters. I probably should note that on here. You put the extension, and then you put the focal length in here, and then we can start to make calculations based on this. So for instance, if I take the second one here, and I say like we're using a 15 millimeter extension, and the focal length of the lens is, we'll leave it at 80. So there's 80 millimeters. I know my magnification number here is going to be 0.188. Okay, can't do anything with that yet, but we can start going in here. I know my aperture factor is going to be 0.842, which still means nothing. But here's the deal. If you have a metered aperture and a metered shutter speed, I can show you what this compensation is going to be. So we plug in the numbers for extension and focal length. Then we come over here for metered aperture, and let's say 2.8. You know, I'll just change these around. I've got the equation set. Metered shutter, let's say it's 1/60th. By the way, this is 1 divided by whatever. So it's 60th of the second at 2.8. My new aperture that I'm going to need to adjust is going to be about 236. And then I also have a shutter factor, and I'm going to shut my shutter speed to 1/43. Now, your camera probably doesn't have those, but what you're going to realize in here is depending on what the millimeters of the tube and the distance that you're putting in there, this can vary widely. So for instance, if I'm metering at 2.8 and my correct exposure is going to be adjusted to 236, that's not a big difference, and I'm probably not going to worry about it too much. But let's say that, for instance, we're in here, and I'm using a 60 millimeter, which is much further from the lens. You can see how this rapidly changes. If I'm metering at 2.8 at 1/60th, my new shutter factor needs to be calculated here. Let's see, metered shutter, metered aperture. So I'm going to set this to 1/20th. So you can see that's a considerable difference if I'm changing that, or my new aperture from 2.8 needs to be 1.6. So you want to get it in that ballpark. I mean, these are giving you perfect mathematical numbers, and most cameras, particularly older manual cameras, you just have, you know, options in stops, maybe half or third stops of what you can choose. So you want to get that close. And so you're basically losing a little more than a stop of light with that extension. So anyway, that's how this is triggered here. And I put multiple rows in here, and you can copy them, and you can do a whole sheet for yourself. And that way you'll have all these for any extension colors you might have. So let's take a break from this, because as exciting as all the math is, I want to flip over right now, and let's get into looking at the test images. We're going to look at the test shots here, and you guys, this is actually kind of difficult for me to do, and the reason I say that is because this is not something I would normally share with people. You know, there's something, I'm not really going for even composition, lighting, anything here, except I'm looking for a couple things, and that's why I needed to take some shots to see what I could get, and that's why I'm showing these to you. Another good reason to do test shots on any project is I realized that here under the deadline of doing the show that I was out of fixer, and I didn't want to wait a week to get more in. So anyway, the fixer that I had is pretty bad, and so there's some weird light streaks and things in here, and so we're not looking at those things. We're going to go through and we're looking for something specific, so this is not photo critique by any stretch. So after that long preface, let's go in here and look. My lovely model Nicole agreed to pose for me here, and what I'm looking for is, we're talking about that juxtaposition of abstraction between blurring something out and something being in focus just via depth of field. So she's holding her hand, maybe 2 feet in front of her face, not quite at arm's length, and anyway, that's what we're looking for. So I'm looking for, if you remember the Gerhard Richter pictures that I was showing you, they were actually drawings, but they were out of focus. And, you know, how much attention or to detail is still retained when it goes out of focus. So just a couple things we're looking at here. This is just a shot that I did for comparison purposes. And this is with that 180 millimeter lens just straight on. And I should have told her to smile or something. She's really going to hate me when she sees this. But anyway, so, you know, you realize that I do have some depth of field at that level, you know, but I really don't, not in that 2 foot separation. I mean, she's out of focus, but it's just kind of a, you know, it'd be really difficult to make a picture out of this. So, you know, all I did was put on the first attachment, which is just that little 15 millimeter attachment, and it makes a huge difference. And you can already see that the depth of field, also look at how far, this is the very closest her hand right here I was able to focus with that lens. So I could do a standard portrait and get her in focus, but I couldn't get any closer than that. So even that first extension allows me to come in this much, and it also decreases that depth of field like we were talking about. So, you know, one idea I might have is people holding up an object and they'll be out of focus in the background. And then just a couple experimentations I did with different f-stops. I think this is about f5.6, and this was at 2.8, and you can see that there's a little bit of a difference here as you go through. Sorry, I think this one's 2.8, this one's 4, and this one is 5.6. I got them out of order here. So at 2.8, we're very blurry here, and she's got an object that she's holding in her hand here with this small organic bulb thing, and you know, you can see she's a little blurred out, maybe almost too blurred out, and I kind of, you know, I'm realizing that, you know, with that kind of proximity, right about f4 is where I want it. And what's really interesting too is, you know, I use Tri-X on this. I'm going to blow this up so you guys, I don't know if you can catch this on the video or not, but you really do get a beautiful grain structure in this, and this is Tri-X and Rodinal. Dilution was 1 to 100, and the time was 20 degrees Celsius, 20 minutes. And despite my fixer that was just disgusting, what happens when fixer goes bad is it's not consistently fixing the negative, and so what happens is it looks like she's actually lit. See, the top of her face is a little more light, and you have a lot of light coming over here, and that was really not the scene. I did have light coming from that angle, but it was not. What happened is your negative starts to develop because the fixer's shot. You can see this in her hand too. You know, it tends to start to blow out in certain spots because the fixer's not actually stopping the development. In this case, I used TF4, and it was old and garbage. And anyway, I've ordered some new stuff. This tells me what I need to know, and now I can focus on what I need to do with the composition, what I can experiment with in those terms, and start dealing with the people who are going to model for this. And I hope to have a whole series of this. It won't be somebody holding up their hand. We're going to go more artistic with composition and stuff. But this is just simply a test to see if, my theory of what I wanted to do was going to work. And I think it is. And so I realized that, those macro extensions, the longest one is so overkill. I mean, it's really for macro photography if you're shooting pennies and trying to blow them up. And so I really didn't use much of that. So this was just that standard 15 millimeter extension tube. So anyway, so there we have it. So that's where we are so far on this project. And I hope this is something you guys are finding useful and finding interesting, and I've had some interesting discussions with people on the way, and so that's been kind of fun too. And so let's keep going on this, and I realized looking at the calendar, I've got about 30 days to make this happen, so it needs to happen pretty quick, and that's printing, framing, finishing, hanging, the whole thing. Most of that'll happen at the very end, but it means if it's going to work right, and from an artistic standpoint, it's going to be something that I like and I'm cool with putting out. I need to get cracking on that. The other issue with this is that because these are portraits, I have to deal with other people's schedule and time as well. So it's going to be really difficult, and I need to find a way to rein that in. Probably what I'm going to do is, and we'll cover this in the next episode, but I need to probably pick some times over the weekend and tell people I will be at a certain location. So come by, have your picture made, blah, blah, blah. And I'll just deal with however many people actually show up, and hopefully it's enough. If we have to go to plan B and hunt people down, then I'll do it. But that's where we are so far. So anyway, I hope this has been useful to you, and that's about it for today. I just wanted to show you the gear I've selected, the test prints that I've been working on, and kind of the effect that I'm going for thus far. Anything can change, you never know, but I think pretty much this is what I'm going with for the time being. So anyway, once again, this has been another episode of The Art of Photography. I'll see you guys in the next show. Later.